One of the coolest, but also weirdest parts of Observable is the reactive nonlinear way that code runs. Let's take a look at how data flows through a notebook to get a better understanding of how Observable runs my code. In this little notebook, I have a cell named A, another named B, and a third named sum, which adds those A and B numbers together. Now, unlike most coding environments, Observable doesn't care about the linear order of these cells. So for example, I can take this B cell and drag it down underneath the sum cell, and everything still works exactly like it did before. So how does this work? How is Observable able to evaluate this sum cell even though it comes before the B value that it needs? Before it tries to run my code, Observable looks at the relationships between cells. In this case, Observable sees that this sum cell in the middle here uses values from both the A cell above and the B cell below. In other words, sum depends on both A and B. And in the code here, I can tell that these are cell references because they are underlined in blue. Observable uses these dependency relationships to figure out what order to run my cells in. Before running a given cell, it has to wait for every other cell it depends on to have finished running. So it first runs any cells that don't depend on anything, like A and B in our example here, and then any cells that depend on those values, like sum. I can get a glimpse of these dependency relationships between cells by looking in the upper right-hand corner at this little dot diagram that we lovingly refer to as the minimap. Each cell in my notebook gets a dot in the minimap, and the dependencies between those cells are shown as lines connecting the dots. Data flows left to right through those connections. If I click on my A cell here, I see a line going out to the right to connect it to sum. This means that A's value is used by sum. Same deal with B. And if I click on the sum cell, I see it has two lines going out to the left to A and B. This means that sum depends on the values of both A and B. We could also say that A and B are upstream of sum, or that sum is downstream of both A and B. When I reorder my cells by, let's say, dragging my sum cell up to the top here, I can see that the dependency relationship hasn't changed. Those lines still go out to the left from sum to A and B. Because Observable only cares about that dependency order, I can reorder cells into whatever visual order I think is most readable or visually compelling. For example, many notebook authors choose to put their beautiful, interesting visualizations and explanatory text at the top of their notebooks and move all of the code that's necessary but not particularly interesting down to an appendix section at the bottom. The dependency order, aka topological order as it's sometimes called, is also what Observable uses to reactively update my notebook anytime a cell's value changes. If I change the value of B and run that cell with Shift-Enter, Observable also reruns any cells that depend on B's value, in this case, sum. In the minimap, I can see those dots flash every time I update the value, and I also see the bar to the left of each cell flash as each cell runs. But when B changes, Observable doesn't run the A cell because its value doesn't depend on B. It doesn't depend on anything, as a matter of fact. Observable will only rerun that cell when its own value changes. Sum, on the other hand, will be run anytime the A or B value changes. If you've worked with spreadsheets before, you're probably already used to this type of reactivity. In a spreadsheet, every time a cell's value changes, any formulas referencing that cell will also be updated. Observable and spreadsheets are actually pretty similar in that way. And back in my notebook, let's say I add another cell here, maybe some markdown text to describe the really advanced math that we're doing. Now, up in my minimap, I see a new dot for my text cell. And it shows that text depends on, or is downstream of, sum. And if I click on my sum cell now, I see sum has two cells upstream of it, A and B, which it depends on, and one cell downstream, which depends on it, text. Now, if I change B again, Observable reactively runs sum because it depends on B, and then runs text because it depends on sum, which also changed. So we could say that text indirectly depends on A and B, which I can see in the minimap by the fact that the A and B dots are shown to the left of text, even though they're not connected with a line. Whereas sum directly depends on A and B, which I can see by that line. So when we talk about reactive data flow in Observable, this is what we mean. Anytime a cell's value changes, Observable lets that value flow to any downstream cells that depend on it, directly or indirectly. So as we saw before, reordering my cells won't break my notebook. What will mess things up is if I introduce a circular dependency. Let's say I make A here reference sum as well. Well, now Observable is stuck because sum depends on A, but A also depends on sum, so Observable can't run either of them first. I can see this error in my minimap too. The cells are now colored red, and the lines between them form a circle. So let's fix this, put it back by removing that sum reference. So the minimap is super handy for getting an overview of those relationships between cells, and it even shows me when I have errors in my notebook. But the minimap only shows me a little chunk of my notebook's dependency network at a time. If I want to see the entire thing in detail, I can use the notebook visualizer. As long as my notebook is public or shared, I can paste its name or link here, and I'll get a visualization of all the dependencies in my notebook. Under the hood, Observable represents each notebook as a directed graph, like the one I see here. Hopefully Observable's data flow makes a little more sense now that we've seen how Observable runs my cells in dependency order, not visual order. Take it from me, it takes a while to wrap your head around this reactive, nonlinear data flow model, so don't be stressed if it feels a little weird or surprising at first. When in doubt, keep an eye on the minimap or use the notebook visualizer to see the dependencies between cells. And check out our notebooks, Introducing Visual Data Flow and How Observable Runs, to deepen your understanding.